The winter of 1839 came to Tennessee like a curse whispered by the dead. It was not the ordinary cold that men could prepare for with firewood and thick wool. This was the kind of winter that turned breath to ice before it left your lips, that made the bark of oak trees split open with sounds like rifle shots in the night. Rivers froze so deep that deer walked across them, their hooves clicking on surfaces that should have been water. The mountains became tombs of white silence, and the valleys filled with snow that rose past a man's knees. The Cherokee called it Unoleyi, the season when the world sleeps with its eyes open, waiting for spring to wake it or death to claim it. Tawakoni did not fear the cold. He had been born in these mountains 32 years ago, raised by a father who taught him to read the language of snow and wind, to find warmth where white men saw only death. He was lean and silent as shadow, with black hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes the color of burnt cedar. His people had called him Ayeli, the walker, because he could travel 50 miles without rest, moving through the forest as if the trees themselves made way for him. He knew every ridge, every hidden trail, every cave where a man could shelter from the storms that turned the sky gray and vicious. But that was before the soldiers came. Before the chains and the wagons and the long walk west that the white men called removal, and the Cherokee called Nunahi Duna Dlohilui, the trail where they cried. What are you thinking about this story? Your opinion is incredibly important to us. Please subscribe, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and let us know if you're enjoying this tale. We truly value your feedback. It helps us create better content for you. It had begun in the spring of 1838, when President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act became something more than words on paper. It became bayonets and burning homes. It became families torn apart and loaded into stockades like cattle. It became 7,000 soldiers descending on Cherokee land, rounding up every man, woman, and child they could find. Tawakoni had refused to go. When the soldiers came to his village near the Hiwassee River, he and 17 others had fled into the mountains. Most were caught within days. 3 were shot trying to escape. The rest were dragged to the stockades in chains, where they waited in filth and hunger for the march that would kill a quarter of them before they reached Oklahoma Territory. Tawakoni survived because he knew how to disappear. He lived alone now, in a cave 10 miles north of what used to be Cherokee land, in a place so remote that even the hunters who made their living tracking runaways avoided it. The cave was small but dry, hidden behind a waterfall that froze solid in winter, creating a curtain of ice that made it invisible from the outside. He ate what he killed: deer, rabbit, sometimes a wild turkey if he was lucky. He spoke to no one, trusted no one, and carried his grief like stones in his chest, heavy and cold and permanent. His wife's name had been Adsilla. It meant blossom in Cherokee, and she had lived up to it, bright and warm and full of life. They had been married for 6 years when the soldiers came, 6 years of happiness that felt in retrospect like a dream he'd had once and could barely remember. When the soldiers rounded up their village, Adsila had been sick with fever. She could not walk fast enough to satisfy the guards. A soldier, a tall man with a scar on his cheek and eyes like dirty ice, had struck her with the butt of his rifle when she stumbled. Tawakoni had tried to go to her, but other soldiers held him back, their hands like iron on his arms. He watched as she fell to the ground, watched as she tried to rise, watched as the soldier struck her again, harder this time, the crack of wood against skull echoing through the morning air. She had died in the mud, blood pooling around her head, her eyes still open and staring at nothing. The soldiers had not allowed Tawakoni to bury her. They made him watch as they kicked her body to the side of the trail and kept moving. "Just another dead Indian," the scarred soldier had said, laughing. "Plenty more where she came from." Tawakoni had escaped 3 days later, slipping his bonds during a rainstorm and vanishing into the forest. He had been running ever since. Not from the soldiers. They had moved on, herding the survivors west, but from the memory of her face, from the sound of that laughter, from the knowledge that he had failed to protect the one person who mattered most. On the morning of December 14th, he woke before dawn to track a deer whose prints he had found the day before. The animal was large, a buck with tracks that suggested 8 points at least, and it was moving north toward the ridge where the pines grew thick and the hunting was good. Tawakoni followed the trail for 3 hours, his moccasins soundless on the frozen ground, his breath steady and controlled, despite the bitter cold that made his fingers ache even inside his fur-lined gloves. The sky was grey and heavy with the promise of more snow, the kind of sky that looked like wet stone and felt like a weight pressing down on the world. He was 2 miles from the ridge when he saw the blood. At first, he thought it was the deer. A hunter's mind goes to what it expects. Prey wounded, dragging itself forward to die in privacy. But the blood was wrong. Too much of it, spread in patterns that spoke of desperation rather than injury. And the trail it left was not the stumbling gait of a dying animal. It was the desperate crawl of a man fighting against his own body's failure, dragging himself forward on hands and knees when his legs could no longer hold him. Tawakoni stopped. He crouched low, his entire body going still in the way predators do when they sense something dangerous nearby. He studied the snow with the careful attention his father had taught him. Handprints, deep and splayed. Knee marks dragged forward in irregular patterns, a long smear where someone had fallen and been unable to rise. He touched the blood with 2 fingers and brought them to his nose. Still warm, less than an hour old. Whoever had left this trail was close. Very close. And they were dying. He heard the sound before he saw the man. A wet, rattling breath. The kind that comes when lungs are filling with fluid, when the body is shutting down one system at a time. Tawakoni moved forward slowly, his hand on the knife at his belt, every sense alert for danger. He rounded a cluster of fallen logs, their bark covered in ice and moss, and stopped. There, collapsed in the snow like a broken marionette, was a black man. He was young, maybe 25, with skin dark as riverstone and a face twisted in agony. His clothes were torn and soaked through with blood and melted snow, a thin cotton shirt that offered no protection against the cold, trousers that had been shredded by brambles and thorns. His left leg was destroyed from thigh to ankle, the muscle torn open, the bone visible in places where the flesh had been ripped away. A bullet wound, Tawakoni knew immediately. The kind slavers used when they wanted a man to suffer, when they wanted him to understand that escape was impossible and death was a mercy they would decide whether or not to grant. The man's eyes were half open, glazed with pain and shock, staring at nothing. His lips were moving, forming words that had no sound, whispering prayers or curses or the names of people who could not hear him. Frost had begun to gather in his hair, on his eyelashes, on the dried blood that covered his hands. In another hour, maybe less, he would be dead. The cold would take him gently and without mercy, and the wolves would find his body by nightfall. Tawakoni should have walked away. There were 100 reasons to do so, each one more rational than the last. The patrols that hunted runaways were ruthless and well-organized. They paid $20 for a captured slave, 10 for a dead one, and they did not ask questions about the condition of the body as long as it could be identified. If they found a Cherokee helping a runaway, they would kill him on sight. No trial, no questions, no mercy. The mountains were full of men who made their living hunting human beings, and they did not care what color you were if you stood in their way. More than that, Tawakoni's own people would not forgive him. The Cherokee who remained in hiding survived by staying invisible, by refusing to draw the attention of the white men who had already taken everything. Helping a runaway slave was the kind of act that brought soldiers and dogs and fire. It was the kind of act that could destroy what little remained of the Cherokee resistance, could get families killed, could turn the mountains into a hunting ground where no one was safe. But Tawakoni did not walk away. He knelt beside the man and placed a hand on his chest, feeling for a heartbeat. It was there, but faint and irregular, like a drum being played by someone who no longer remembered the rhythm. The man's eyes flickered, struggled to focus, and then locked onto Tawakoni's face with sudden, desperate intensity. His lips moved again, and this time sound came out. "They took my wife." The words were barely a whisper, each one pushed out with enormous effort, but they carried the weight of a scream. The man's hand reached up, trembling violently, and gripped Tawakoni's wrist with surprising strength. His eyes were wide now, fully conscious for just a moment, pleading not for his own life, but for something else, something more important than survival. "Please, find her. They took her. Please." Then his hand fell away, and his eyes rolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness like a stone sinking into deep water. Tawakoni sat back on his heels. He looked at the blood in the snow, spreading out in a dark pool that steamed in the freezing air. He looked at the torn leg, at the frostbitten hands, at the young face that would be dead by sunset. He thought about his own wife, about Adsila, about the way she had looked at him the last time he saw her alive, with eyes that said, "Remember me. Do not let them make you forget. Do not let them turn you into stone." He thought about the man who had killed her, the soldier with the scarred cheek and the cruel laugh, the man who had struck her down like she was nothing, like she was less than human, like her life had no value beyond whatever inconvenience her death might cause. He thought about what his father had told him when he was a boy, before the white men came, before the treaties and the lies and the long betrayal. A man who turns away from suffering becomes the mountain that creates it. A man who witnesses cruelty and does nothing becomes part of that cruelty, no matter how he justifies his silence. Tawakoni stood. He looked north, toward the ridge where the deer had gone. Then he looked down at the dying man in the snow. "You are not my people," he said quietly in Cherokee, "but you are hunted like my people, and that makes you my brother." He bent down, slid his arms under the man's body, and lifted him onto his back. The man was heavy, dead weight, his body limp and cold, his blood soaking into Tawakoni's shirt and freezing there. Tawakoni adjusted the load, securing the man's arms over his shoulders, his legs wrapped around his waist, the way he would carry a deer or a bundle of furs. Blood dripped down Tawakoni's side, warm at first, then cold and sticky. He could feel the man's shallow breath against his neck, feel the faint pulse where their bodies pressed together. 40 miles. That was the distance to the Cherokee camp, where the last of the hidden families lived, where the elders maintained a desperate, precarious existence in defiance of every law and every soldier. 40 miles through frozen forest, across ice rivers, over ridges where the wind cut like broken glass and the temperature dropped low enough to kill a man in his sleep. 40 miles with a dying man on his back and patrols hunting them both. Tawakoni took his first step. The snow crunched under his feet. The trees stood silent around him, their branches heavy with ice, their trunks dark against the white ground. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sound echoed through the mountains, long and lonely, like a warning or a prayer or a farewell to the dead. Tawakoni did not look back. He walked north into the cold, into the unknown, carrying a man whose name he did not know, whose life he had no reason to save, whose people had no connection to his own, except the shared experience of being hunted, of being considered less than human, of knowing that the world had decided they did not deserve to exist. But he carried him anyway, because some debts are older than nations. Some bonds are written in blood and grief and the terrible recognition that passes between people who have suffered the same cruelty. Some men, when they are broken by the same forces, become something stronger than either of them could have been alone. The hunter and the slave, two ghosts in the snow, and the long, impossible walk that would bind them forever. The first mile was the hardest, though not for the reasons Tawakoni expected. The weight was manageable. Samuel, he would learn later, though the man remained unconscious and the name came from fevered mumblings days afterward, was solid, but no heavier than a winter's worth of furs or a full-grown deer. The cold was brutal, the kind that made every breath feel like swallowing broken glass, but Tawakoni had endured worse. His body was hardened by years of survival in these mountains, trained to function when comfort was impossible, and pain was just another condition of existence. No, the hardest part was the choice itself. Every step Tawakoni took, he felt the weight of what he was doing settle more heavily on his shoulders than any physical burden ever could. He was crossing a line that could not be uncrossed, making himself an enemy of every white man in Tennessee, and quite possibly an outcast among his own people. The Cherokee who remained in hiding had survived by being invisible, by avoiding any action that might draw attention from the authorities. Helping a runaway slave was exactly the kind of action that brought soldiers and tracking dogs and systematic searches that could destroy everything they had worked to preserve. But Tawakoni kept walking, because the alternative, leaving the man to die in the snow, would have meant becoming the very thing the white men wanted him to be: broken, defeated, willing to turn away from suffering to preserve his own safety. And that was a death of a different kind, slower but no less final. The forest was dense here, thick with pine and oak and the skeletal remains of dogwood trees stripped bare by winter. Tawakoni moved carefully, avoiding the open trails where patrols might ride, keeping to the places where the undergrowth was thickest and the snow lay in uneven drifts that would hide their tracks. He stopped every quarter-mile to listen, for voices, for horses, for the distant bark of tracking dogs. But there was only silence, the kind of silence that feels like the forest is holding its breath, waiting to see what will happen next. Samuel had not stirred since Tawakoni lifted him. His head lolled against Tawakoni's shoulder, his breathing shallow and wet, each exhalation accompanied by a faint rattle that spoke of fluid in the lungs, of a body shutting down one system at a time. Blood soaked through Tawakoni's doeskin shirt, warm at first, then cold and sticky, freezing in patches that crackled when he moved. The leg wound was catastrophic, worse than Tawakoni had initially assessed. The bullet had torn through muscle and shattered bone, leaving tissue that was already beginning to swell and discolor. If infection set in, the man would lose the leg. If fever took him before that, he would lose his life. And if the cold claimed him before either, he would simply stop breathing quietly and without ceremony. But Tawakoni could not stop to treat him. Not yet. Not until they were far enough from the place where Samuel had fallen. Patrols always returned to the site of a hunt. They would find the blood trail in the snow, impossible to miss, a bright red path that told a story any tracker could read. They would know their prey had not died where they left him. They would know someone had intervened, and they would come looking, with horses and weapons, and the absolute confidence of men who believed the law was on their side. By the time the sun reached its highest point, a pale disk hidden behind grey clouds that promised more snow, Tawakoni had covered nearly 8 miles. His legs burned with the constant effort of navigating uneven terrain while carrying another man's weight. His shoulders ached where Samuel's arms pressed down, creating pressure points that would become bruises by nightfall. Sweat froze on his face despite the cold, forming tiny crystals in his eyebrows and beard. But he did not slow. He had learned long ago, through necessity and brutal experience, how to turn his body into a machine, how to shut off the part of his mind that screamed for rest, and let instinct and discipline carry him forward. He reached a frozen creek just after midday. The ice was thick enough to hold his weight. He could tell by the color and the sound it made when he tapped it with his foot, but he did not trust it. Ice was treacherous, prone to hidden weaknesses, and a fall through it would mean death for both of them. Instead, he waded into the shallows where the water still moved, breaking through the thin crust with his feet. The cold was instant and vicious, a shock that traveled up his legs and into his spine, making his teeth clench and his breath hiss out in a sharp burst. He carried Samuel across, the water rising to his knees, his thighs, soaking his leggings and turning his legs to stone. On the far side, he set Samuel down for the first time since lifting him. The man's face was grey, his lips blue, frost gathering in his hair and on his closed eyelids. Tawakoni pressed 2 fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, but faint and irregular, like a drum being played by hands that were losing their strength. Too faint, dangerously faint. Tawakoni opened Samuel's coat, a ragged thing, torn and crusted with ice and blood, and examined the wound. The bleeding had slowed to a sluggish seep, but the flesh around it was swollen and discolored, turning yellow-green at the edges. Bad signs. Very bad. Infection was setting in, faster than Tawakoni had hoped, spreading through tissue that was already damaged beyond what the body could easily repair. He worked quickly, his fingers clumsy with cold but still precise. He pulled strips of cloth from his own shirt, tore them into long bandages, and bound the leg as tightly as he dared, without cutting off circulation entirely. It would not heal the wound, but it would slow the blood loss and provide some compression against the swelling. Then he took a small leather pouch from his belt and opened it with numb fingers. Inside was a mixture his mother had taught him to make when he was a boy: ground willow bark for pain, dried yarrow to stop bleeding, and crushed juniper berries mixed with bear fat to prevent infection. He spread it over the wound, packing it into the torn flesh with the same careful attention he would give to preparing a hide for tanning. The man did not wake, did not even flinch. Tawakoni rewrapped the leg, secured the bandages, and checked Samuel's pulse again. Still there, still weak. But there, that was something. Not much, but something. He lifted Samuel again and kept walking. The afternoon stretched into evening, the light fading from grey to darker grey to the deep blue-black that precedes true night. The temperature dropped further, falling to levels that made breathing painful and exposed skin dangerously vulnerable to frostbite. Tawakoni's pace slowed as exhaustion began to set in, his muscles trembling with the sustained effort, his lungs burning from the cold air. But he pushed forward, driven by a combination of stubbornness, responsibility, and something else he could not quite name, a sense that this act, this impossible burden he had taken on, meant something beyond the immediate survival of 2 men. As darkness fell, the snow began again. Not the gentle, drifting snow of a peaceful winter evening, but thick, heavy flakes that fell with relentless intensity, erasing tracks and turning the world into a white void where visibility extended no more than 20 feet in any direction. Tawakoni could no longer see the path ahead clearly. He navigated by instinct, by the feel of the slope beneath his feet, by the direction of the wind on his face, by the subtle variations in tree density that told him where ridges rose and valleys fell. He found shelter just as true darkness settled over the mountains. It was a hollow beneath a fallen oak, a massive tree that had been struck by lightning years ago and split down the middle, creating a natural shelter where the 2 halves leaned against each other. The space inside was just large enough for 2 men to lie down, protected from the wind and snow by the thick bark and the angle of the trunk. Tawakoni lowered Samuel to the ground with a groan, his entire body protesting the sudden absence of weight. He collapsed beside him, his legs shaking, his vision blurred with exhaustion. For several minutes, he simply sat there, breathing hard, letting his body remember what rest felt like. Then, with enormous effort, he forced himself to move. He untied the cord around his pack and pulled out his supplies. A strip of dried venison, tough as leather, and nearly as tasteless. a handful of parched corn, each kernel as hard as a stone. He chewed slowly, mechanically, forcing himself to swallow despite having no appetite. Food was fuel. Fuel kept the body moving, and he needed to keep moving. He checked Samuel's wound again. The bandages were soaked through, the blood seeping steadily despite the compression. The skin around the injury was hot to the touch, radiating fever heat that spoke of infection spreading through the body. Samuel's face was flushed now, his breathing faster and shallower than before. Fever, the killer that came after the wound, the silent enemy that took more lives than bullets ever could. Cherokee built a small fire using tinder he kept wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture. The flames were weak, barely larger than his palm, fed by small twigs and dried moss. The fire gave off minimal heat and even less light, but it was enough to take the edge off the brutal cold and provide enough warmth to melt snow for drinking water. He filled his tin cup with snow and held it over the flames until the snow melted and the water was lukewarm. Then he lifted Samuel's head, tilting it back, and held the cup to his lips. Most of the water dribbled out, running down his chin and soaking into his shirt, but some went down. Cherokee repeated the process 3 times, forcing small amounts of water into the unconscious man, knowing that dehydration was as dangerous as the wound itself. "Stay with me," Cherokee said quietly, in English this time. "You do not get to die here. Not after I carried you this far." Samuel's eyelids fluttered, his lips moved, forming words that had no sound. And then, for the first time since Cherokee had found him, he spoke. "Sarah!" The word was barely audible, more breath than sound, but it carried everything. Love, loss, desperation, grief compressed into 2 syllables. "Your wife?" Cherokee asked, leaning closer. Samuel's eyes opened, just a crack. They were glassy with fever, unfocused, seeing something that was not there, but there was consciousness in them, however fragile. A flicker of awareness, struggling against the dark. "They sold her," Samuel whispered, each word an enormous effort. "2 days before, I ran. Master said she was going south, to Louisiana, to the cane fields." His voice broke. Tears ran down his face, freezing before they reached his jaw, creating tiny trails of ice. "I tried to get her back, broke into the overseer's house at night, took his gun. Thought I could trade it for her freedom. Thought I could—" He coughed, a deep, wet sound that shook his entire body. Blood flecked his lips, dark and viscous. "They came after me. 6 men. Dogs that wouldn't stop. I ran till my legs gave out, ran till I couldn't feel anything anymore. They shot me, laughed while I bled, said they'd leave me for the wolves, said I'd be a lesson to anyone else who thought about running." Samuel's hand reached out, gripping Cherokee's wrist with surprising strength for a man so close to death. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking, breaking on the word. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Cherokee did not answer immediately. He stared into the small fire, watching the flames dance and twist, each one briefly bright before fading into smoke and ash. He thought about Adsila, about the way she had smiled when they were first married, shy and beautiful, about the way she sang while she worked, her voice carrying through their village like a gift, about the way she had looked at him the last time he saw her alive, with eyes that said, "Remember me. Do not forget what they did. Do not let their cruelty make you cruel." "Because," Cherokee said finally, his voice flat and emotionless, "they took my wife, too." Samuel's grip tightened, his eyes widened, suddenly more focused, more present. "The soldiers," Cherokee continued, "when they forced us from our land, when they rounded us up like animals and put us in chains, my wife was sick, fever. She could not keep pace with the march, could not walk fast enough to satisfy the guards. A soldier struck her with his rifle. She fell. I tried to go to her, but other soldiers held me back, held my arms, made me watch as she died in the mud. His voice remained flat, but his hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, the tendons standing out like cords. The man who killed her, Tawakoni said, wore a badge, called himself a lawman. I heard him boast about it later, in the stockade where they kept us. He said she was just another Indian, just another inconvenience. He laughed about it, laughed. He looked at Samuel, his eyes hard and cold. I did not have the strength to save her, but I can save you. And maybe that means something. Maybe it changes something. I do not know, but I have to try. Samuel stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, his grip loosened. His eyes began to close. But before he slipped back into unconsciousness, he whispered 2 words, "Thank you." Tawakoni did not respond. He fed the fire with small twigs, rationing his fuel carefully. He checked the wound one more time, changed the bandages, applied more medicine, and when the flames finally died, reduced to glowing embers that gave off more memory of heat than actual warmth, he wrapped himself and Samuel in the single blanket he carried and tried to sleep. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains like the voices of the dead. The snow fell in thick curtains, erasing their tracks, covering their shelter, turning the world into an endless expanse of white. And somewhere in the darkness, far behind them but moving closer with every passing hour, men with rifles and dogs were beginning to search. By the 3rd day, death felt inevitable. Tawakoni woke before dawn to find Samuel burning with fever. The man's skin was hot enough to hurt when touched, his face flushed and slick with sweat despite the freezing temperature. He thrashed in his sleep, muttering words that made no sense, fragments of prayers and conversations with people who were not there. The wound had turned a sickly yellow-green, the infection spreading outward in dark tendrils visible beneath the skin. The flesh around it was grotesquely swollen, tight as a drum, and when Tawakoni pressed it gently with his fingers, fluid oozed out, thick and foul-smelling. Samuel was dying, slowly but certainly, and there was nothing Tawakoni could do to stop it except keep moving and hope they reached the Cherokee camp before the infection reached his heart. Tawakoni forced himself to eat, more dried meat, more parched corn, each bite requiring conscious effort to chew and swallow. Then he lifted Samuel onto his back once more and began walking. 23 miles now, 17 to go. The terrain had grown steeper, the mountains rising in jagged ridges that cut against the pale morning sky like broken teeth. Every step was agony. Tawakoni's legs trembled constantly, the muscles pushed far beyond their normal limits. His back felt like it was being slowly torn apart, the vertebrae grinding together with each movement. His shoulders had gone numb hours ago, the nerves overwhelmed by sustained pressure. But he kept walking, because stopping meant death. Stopping meant failure. And failure was not acceptable. They crossed another frozen river on the afternoon of the 3rd day. This one was wider than the last, perhaps 60 feet across, with ice that looked thick but made ominous groaning sounds when Tawakoni tested it with his foot. He stood at the edge for several minutes, studying the surface, looking for the telltale signs of weak spots, slight discolorations, small cracks, areas where snow had melted and refrozen in uneven patterns. Finally, he stepped onto the ice. It held. He took another step, then another, moving slowly, distributing his weight as evenly as possible, listening for any sound that might indicate the ice was about to fail. Halfway across, he heard it groan beneath him, a deep, ominous sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He froze, his heart pounding, Samuel's weight pressing down on him. For 10 seconds, maybe 15, he did not breathe, did not move, just stood perfectly still and waited to see if the ice would hold or if they would both plunge into water cold enough to stop a man's heart in less than a minute. The groaning stopped. The ice held. Tawakoni exhaled slowly and kept moving, one careful step at a time until he reached the far bank. As he climbed out of the riverbed, his legs nearly gave out. He caught himself against a tree, breathing hard, and allowed himself 30 seconds of rest before continuing. That was when he heard the dogs. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but there was no mistaking it. The high, frenzied barking of hounds on a scent, the sound that every runaway slave and every fugitive Cherokee knew and feared. They were far away, perhaps 2 miles, maybe more. But they were coming, and they were fast. Tawakoni did not waste time analyzing or planning. He simply ran. Running with a full-grown man on your shoulders is not like running unencumbered. It is not even like running with a heavy pack. Every step is a battle against gravity and momentum. Every movement requires precise balance. The weight shifts constantly, threatening to pull you backward or sideways. Your center of gravity is all wrong, too high and too far back. Your legs have to work twice as hard to propel you forward. Your lungs burn, your vision narrows, every muscle in your body screams in protest. Tawakoni ran anyway. He crashed through the underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, his moccasins slipping on ice and loose stone. Branches tore at his face and clothes. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one burning in his lungs. Samuel's weight shifted, nearly pulling him backward, but he adjusted, compensated, kept moving. The barking grew louder, closer. He could hear individual dogs now, their voices distinct, could hear them working the scent, following the trail he had left in the snow. Behind them, fainter but still audible, came the shouts of men, commands, encouragements, the sounds of hunters who had found their prey and knew the chase was almost over. Tawakoni reached a steep slope and scrambled up it, his hands clawing at frozen earth and exposed roots, his legs driving him upward through pure will. At the top, he paused for just a moment, just one moment to gasp for air and look back. There, through the trees, 5 men on horseback, their figures dark against the white snow, moving fast but carefully, following the dogs. And ahead of them, racing through the forest with single-minded determination, 6 dogs, lean and hungry, their breath steaming, their eyes focused on nothing but the scent they were following. They had found the trail. They would be here in minutes, maybe less. Tawakoni turned and ran harder. He did not know how long he ran. Time became meaningless, lost in the pure animal panic of flight, in the rhythm of breath and heartbeat, and the pounding of feet against frozen ground. The forest blurred around him. His body moved on autopilot, guided by some deep, primal part of his brain that understood only one imperative: survive. He reached a narrow ravine and jumped without thinking, without judging the distance or considering the consequences. For one terrifying second he was airborne, Samuel's weight threatening to pull him backward into empty space. Then he landed hard on the far side, the impact sending shockwaves of pain through his knees and spine, nearly buckling his legs. Samuel groaned, his head snapping back, but Tawakoni did not stop, could not stop. He kept moving. Behind him, the dogs were so close he could hear their claws scrabbling on stone, hear their panting breath, hear the wet snap of their jaws as they anticipated the kill. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the lead dog break through the tree line, not 30 yards behind him, its eyes locked on him, foam dripping from its mouth, muscles bunching for a final sprint. Tawakoni spun to face it, drawing his knife in one smooth motion. The dog leaped, its jaws wide, going for his throat. Tawakoni sidestepped and slashed upward in a single fluid movement. The blade connected with the dog's chest, cutting deep, and the animal yelped and fell, blood steaming in the cold air as it hit the ground and did not rise. The second dog came immediately after. Tawakoni kicked it in the chest, putting all his remaining strength into the blow, sending it tumbling backward into a tree with a sickening crack. The third dog circled, growling low in its throat, more cautious now, waiting for an opening. Then a gunshot cracked through the air. The bullet struck a tree 2 feet from Tawakoni's head, sending splinters of bark flying. He looked up and saw the riders emerging from the forest, their horses picking their way carefully through the rough terrain. 5 men, all of them armed. One of them, A tall man with a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat raised his rifle again, taking careful aim. "That's far enough, Redskin," the man shouted. "Drop the knife and get down on your knees." Tawakoni did not hesitate. He turned and ran. Another shot. The bullet whipped past his ear, so close he felt the heat of it. The men shouted, spurring their horses forward, but the terrain was too rough for the animals to maintain speed. They dismounted, chasing on foot now, their boots crunching through the snow, their breath coming in harsh gasps. Tawakoni reached a cluster of massive boulders and ducked behind them. He lowered Samuel to the ground as gently as circumstances allowed and crouched, his knife still in his hand, his chest heaving. He could hear the men approaching, their voices loud and confident, the voices of men who believed victory was certain. "Got him cornered now. Check behind those rocks. Careful, he's armed. Probably got that runaway with him. 2 birds with 1 stone." Footsteps, close now, very close. Tawakoni tightened his grip on the knife. He glanced at Samuel, who was still unconscious, his face pale as death. If Tawakoni fought, they would both die. The men had guns, numbers, and the certainty of being on the right side of the law. If he ran and left Samuel, the slave would die anyway, either from his wounds or from being shot the moment the patrol found him. There was no good choice, only bad ones and worse ones. Only decisions that led to death, no matter which path he chose. And then, from somewhere above, a voice rang out in Cherokee, clear and strong and unexpected. "Tawakoni, Osio Chosdada!" "Brother, hold!" Tawakoni's head snapped up. Standing on top of the largest boulder, silhouetted against the grey sky like a figure from legend, was a man he had not seen in over a year. Kanuna. Kanuna was older than Tawakoni, perhaps 45, with a face lined by hardship and a greying beard that reached halfway down his chest. He had been a warrior before removal, had fought in the border skirmishes against settlers who kept pushing westward into Cherokee land. His body still carried the scars of those battles, a long white line across his ribs where a knife had nearly killed him, a divot in his left shoulder where a musket ball had shattered the bone. He wore a long coat made of bear hide that made him look even larger than he was, and he carried a rifle, an old flintlock, battered but well-maintained and deadly in the right hands. And he was not alone. 3 more Cherokee men emerged from behind the boulders, moving with the silent confidence of people who knew these mountains intimately. All of them were armed. All of them had their weapons trained on the approaching patrol. And all of them wore expressions that said they were prepared to use those weapons without hesitation. The tall man with the wide-brimmed hat stopped abruptly. He looked up at Kanuna, then at the other Cherokee men, then back at Tawakoni crouched behind the boulder. His face went from confident to calculating in an instant. "This ain't your fight, Indian," the man said, his voice losing some of its certainty. "That's slave's property, legal property. We got papers on him. You hand him over, we'll let you go. No trouble." Kanuna said nothing for a long moment. He simply stood there, his rifle aimed steadily at the man's chest, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Then slowly he smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. "War already started," Kanuna said in English, his accent thick but his words perfectly clear. "You just too stupid to notice." The patrol leader's face flushed red. His hand tightened on his rifle. "You pull that trigger. You're starting something you can't finish. There's 5 of us and 4 of you, and there's 1,000 more white men who'll come looking if you kill us." "Yes," Kanuna said calmly. "And there are 10,000 Cherokee who have already lost everything. What do we have left to lose?" For a long moment, no one moved. The wind howled through the rocks. Snow began to fall again, thick flakes that settled on weapons and shoulders and the frozen ground. The dogs that remained alive whined nervously, sensing the tension, sensing that something was about to happen that would change everything. Finally, the patrol leader lowered his rifle, Not because he was afraid, though fear was clearly present in his eyes, but because he was a man who understood mathematics. 4 rifles pointed at 5 men meant at least 2 of them would die in the first volley, maybe 3, maybe all 5 if the Cherokee were good shots. And even if the patrol won, even if they killed every Cherokee standing before them, what would they have gained? 2 dead bodies, a runaway slave who was probably going to die anyway, and a Cherokee who was already classified as fugitive. It was not worth it. "This ain't over," the patrol leader said, backing away slowly. "Not by a long shot. You just made enemies of every white man in Tennessee." "Good," Kanuna replied. "Now we are equal. Because every Cherokee in Tennessee has been your enemy since the day your people arrived." The patrol retreated, backing away into the forest, their eyes never leaving the rifles trained on them. When they were gone, when the sound of their footsteps had faded into the distance, Kanuna climbed down from the boulder and approached Tawakoni. "You are a fool," he said in Cherokee, though his tone carried affection rather than anger. "A brave fool, a magnificent fool, but still a fool." Tawakoni exhaled, his entire body shaking with exhaustion and relief. "Thank you, brother." Kanuna looked at Samuel, still unconscious on the ground, his breathing shallow and labored. "Who is he?" "A brother," Tawakoni said simply. Kanuna studied him for a long moment, his eyes searching Tawakoni's face. Then slowly he nodded. "Then we carry him together," Kanuna said, "and we run, because they will return with more men, and next time we may not be so fortunate." The Cherokee camp was not what Samuel expected when consciousness finally returned. He had been lost in fever dreams for days, how many he did not know. In his lucid moments, which were few and brief, he remembered fragments, the sensation of being carried, voices speaking in a language that sounded like water flowing over stones, the smell of wood smoke and something medicinal, cold water pressed to his cracked lips. But mostly he remembered the dreams, terrible, vivid dreams, where Sarah's face faded like morning mist, no matter how hard he tried to hold on to it. Dreams where the plantation burned and he could not find her in the smoke. Dreams where death itself appeared as a patient figure waiting just beyond the edge of sleep, neither cruel nor kind, simply inevitable. When his eyes finally opened and stayed open, it was late afternoon. Weak winter sunlight filtered through gaps in a shelter made of pine branches and stretched canvas, casting golden patterns on the dirt floor. A fire burned nearby, well-tended and smokeless, radiating steady warmth. And sitting beside him, working on a piece of leather with a bone needle, was a Cherokee woman, with grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that carried both kindness and steel. She noticed him stirring and set her work aside. She spoke in Cherokee, her voice soft and measured, the words incomprehensible, but the tone unmistakable. She was checking on him, assessing his condition, making sure he was truly conscious and not just surfacing briefly before sinking back into fever. "Water," Samuel croaked, his throat dry as sand, his tongue feeling too large for his mouth. The woman nodded and lifted a wooden cup to his lips. He drank greedily, the cold water soothing his parched throat, each swallow painful but necessary. When he was finished, she set the cup aside and studied his face with the careful attention of someone who had seen much death and learned to recognize when life would persist. She nodded once, apparently satisfied, and spoke again in Cherokee, words he did not understand but which sounded approving. A moment later, Tawakoni entered the shelter. He looked different than Samuel remembered from those fragmentary moments of consciousness during the journey. Cleaner, for one thing, his long black hair washed and tied back with a leather cord, his face free of the frost and grime that had covered it. But there was something else too, something deeper. A weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, a weight in his eyes that spoke of burdens carried and costs paid. "You are awake," Tawakoni said, crouching beside the fire with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable with his body. "How long?" Samuel asked. 4 days since we arrived here. 10 days since I found you in the snow. Samuel stared at him, trying to process this information. 10 days. He had been unconscious for most of it, but the memory of those first few days was vivid enough. The impossible cold, the relentless pain, the certain knowledge that he was dying. And this man, this Cherokee hunter, who had no reason to care whether he lived or died, had carried him through it all. "You carried me," Samuel said. 40 miles through the mountains in winter. Why? It was the same question he had asked before, in that brief moment of clarity in the hollow beneath the fallen oak. But this time Tawakoni's answer was different, more complete, as if he had spent the intervening days considering how to explain something that defied easy explanation. "Because you reminded me of someone I failed to save," Tawakoni said quietly. "And because no man should die alone in the snow, forgotten and unmourned. And because your suffering and my suffering come from the same source, from men who believe some lives matter less than others, who hunt people for profit and call it law." Samuel looked down at his leg. It was heavily bandaged, the wound still painful, but no longer the screaming agony it had been. Someone, the woman he assumed, had cleaned and treated it with a level of skill that seemed almost miraculous. The flesh around the bandages was still discolored, still swollen, but the angry red lines that indicated spreading infection were gone. "Will I walk again?" Samuel asked, needing to know, needing to understand what his future looked like. "Yes," the woman said, speaking English for the first time, her accent thick but her words clear. "But not soon, and not without pain. The bone was shattered, it will heal crooked. You will limp always, but you will walk." Samuel nodded slowly, absorbing this. A limp was a small price to pay for life. A limp meant he could still move, still search, still fight if necessary. A limp was infinitely better than death in the snow, or capture and return to the plantation where new horrors would await. "Thank you," he said, looking at both of them. I don't know how to repay what you've done for me." "You live," Tawakoni said simply. "You survive. You carry forward. That is repayment enough." But Samuel shook his head, his jaw tightening with determination. "No, it's not enough." He looked directly at Tawakoni, his eyes hard, despite his weakened condition. "You saved my life. Now, I want to help you take theirs." Tawakoni's expression shifted, became more guarded. "Whose lives?" "The men who shot me," Samuel said. "The patrol that hunted me. I heard what they said when they left me to die. I know who they are. I know where they make camp. And I know something else." He paused, his jaw working, anger and grief warring in his eyes. "They're the same men who killed your wife." The silence that fell over the shelter was absolute. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as if reality itself was holding its breath. Tawakoni's entire body went rigid, his hands clenching into fists, his breathing quickening. The woman, her name was Ayita, Samuel would learn later, and she was Kanuna's sister, watched her friend with concern etched deep in her weathered face. "How do you know this?" Tawakoni asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of mountains. "Because I heard them boasting about it," Samuel said. 2 years ago, when they brought a group of Cherokee through the plantation where I was enslaved. They were guards on the removal trail. They stopped for supplies and water. While they were there, they talked, bragged about the things they'd done, the people they'd killed. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, he laughed about a Cherokee woman who wouldn't stop singing, said her voice annoyed him, said he cracked her skull open with his rifle butt just to shut her up, said it felt good. Tawakoni's breathing had become ragged. His whole body trembled with barely contained rage. For a moment, Samuel thought the Cherokee might strike him, might lash out at the messenger who had brought this terrible confirmation. But then Tawakoni closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, forcing himself toward calm through what must have been enormous effort. "His name?" Tawakoni asked, eyes still closed. Silas Hark, Samuel said. He leads the patrol. He's the one who shot me, the one who gave the order to leave me for dead, and from what I heard him say to the others while I was bleeding, he's the same man who killed your wife on the trail. Tawakoni opened his eyes. They were cold now, empty of everything except a single burning purpose that was almost frightening in its intensity. Where is he? The question was flat, emotionless, but underneath was something vast and terrible. There's a camp, Samuel said, maybe 10 miles south of here. He and his men use it as a base when they're hunting runaways or checking on Cherokee, who are supposed to be gone. I've been there before. They brought me there once, when I was first caught trying to run 3 years ago. I know the layout. I know the way. Tawakoni stood abruptly. He looked at Ayita, who had been listening in silence, her face grave and troubled. Edodakana nelis gisti, she said in Cherokee. The elder will not approve. I do not need his approval, Tawakoni replied in the same language. You will bring death to our people. More soldiers, more searches. We barely survive as it is. Death is already here, Tawakoni said, his voice rising slightly. It has been here since the white men came. Since they signed treaties they never intended to honor. Since they drove us from our land and killed us on the trail. I'm only deciding whose death it will be this time. He turned back to Samuel, switching to English. When can you walk? Not for weeks, Samuel admitted, frustrated by his own weakness. But I can draw you a map, show you exactly where they are, how many men, what weapons they carry, their routines, everything I know. Tawakoni nodded once, decisive. Do it. Samuel reached for a stick lying near the fire and began scratching lines in the packed dirt floor of the shelter. As he worked, he spoke, his voice steady despite the images his words conjured. There are 5 of them total. Silas Hark, like I said, he's the leader. Then there's Roy Jessup, a big man, thick as a tree trunk, carries a double-barrel shotgun. Clayton Moss, thin, fast, good with a knife, prefers close work. And 2 brothers, Dutch and Abel Crane. They're young, maybe 20, but mean as hell, grew up hunting and have no conscience about what they hunt. He drew the outline of a clearing, surrounded by marks representing trees. The camp is in a small valley here, sheltered from the wind by a semicircle of pines. They sleep in 2 canvas tents, Hark and Jessup in one, the other 3 in the second. They always keep a man on watch at night, rotating every few hours. They're usually disciplined about it early in the evening, but by midnight they're often drunk and careless. Horses are tied on a line between 2 trees on the western edge of the clearing. Weapons are usually stacked near the fire, but each man keeps a pistol close while sleeping. Tawakoni studied the map intently, committing every detail to memory. When do they move? Dawn, Samuel said. They ride out at first light to check their traps. They set snares for runaways, actual steel traps like you'd use for animals. They hunt until dusk, then return to camp. They're most vulnerable at night, especially late after they've been drinking. And during the day, the camp is empty. Usually 1 man stays behind. Whoever drew the short straw or whoever is nursing injuries or a hangover. Tawakoni nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through possibilities, calculating risks, planning approaches. Then he looked at Samuel with surprising intensity. You want vengeance, he said. But you cannot walk. You cannot fight. So why tell me this? What do you hope to gain? Samuel met his eyes without flinching. Because vengeance isn't just for the living, he said. It's for the dead. For your wife. For mine. For every person they've hunted and killed and laughed about afterward. I can't swing the blade or pull the trigger, but I can point you toward their throats. I can give you the knowledge you need to make them answer for what they've done. He paused, his voice dropping lower, becoming almost confessional. And because maybe, if you do this, it will stop them from taking anyone else's wife or husband or child. Maybe it will save someone else from the pain we're both carrying. Tawakoni was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he crouched down and placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, a gesture that in any other context might have seemed small, but which carried enormous weight. Your wife, Tawakoni said. You said they sold her south, to Louisiana, to the cane fields. Samuel nodded, his jaw tightening against the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him whenever he thought of Sarah, wherever she was, whatever she was enduring. If I do this, Tawakoni said carefully, if I kill these men, it will not bring her back. It will not change what they did to you. It will not undo any of the suffering. I know, Samuel said, but it will stop them from creating more suffering. And maybe, he paused, struggling with words, maybe it will mean something. Maybe it will prove that we're not just things to be hunted and discarded, that our lives matter, that there are consequences. Tawakoni studied him for several long seconds. Then, slowly, he nodded. Then we do this together, Tawakoni said. You give me the map and the knowledge. I take the walk into darkness, and when I return, if I return, we find your wife, together, as brothers. Samuel's eyes widened in disbelief. You would do that? Help me search for her? In Louisiana? You are my brother now, Tawakoni said simply. And brothers do not abandon each other's wives to suffer alone. If she lives, we will find her. If she does not, he paused, then we will know, and that knowledge is better than living forever with uncertainty. Samuel's throat tightened. For the first time in 10 days, for the first time since Sarah had been torn from his arms and sold away, he felt something other than pain and grief and helpless rage. He felt hope, fragile, maybe foolish, but hope nonetheless. Thank you, Samuel whispered, his voice breaking. Tawakoni stood. He looked at the map one last time, his eyes tracing every line, every mark, burning the information into his memory with the intensity of a man preparing for war. Then he turned and walked out of the shelter, into the cold afternoon air, into whatever awaited him. And somewhere in the darkness, 10 miles away in a sheltered valley, 5 men who had made careers out of hunting human beings slept soundly, unaware that death itself was walking toward them through the snow, driven by grief and justice, and a debt that could only be paid in blood. The night was moonless and bitter cold when Tawakoni reached the patrol camp. He had left the Cherokee settlement just after dusk, moving alone through the darkening forest, with nothing but his knife, his tomahawk, and the map Samuel had drawn burned into his memory. Kanuna had tried to stop him, had argued passionately that this was suicide, that one man could not prevail against 5 armed and experienced killers, that even if he succeeded, he would bring catastrophic attention to the remaining Cherokee. The elders had forbidden the mission outright, had declared that Tawakoni would be cast out if he pursued this course, that he would no longer be welcome among them. Even Ayita, usually supportive, had begged him to reconsider. Your wife is dead, she had said, not unkindly, but with brutal honesty. Killing her murderers will not bring her back. It will only add more death to a world already drowning in it. But Tawakoni had not listened, could not listen. There are some things a man must do alone, some debts that can only be paid in blood, some wounds that never heal but only grow worse with time unless cauterized by action. He traveled for 3 hours through complete darkness, moving by memory and instinct through terrain he knew intimately. Every ridge, every ravine, every hidden trail was part of him, woven into his consciousness like the lines on his own hands. He moved in absolute silence, his moccasins making no sound on the frozen ground, his breathing controlled and shallow. He was not just traveling, he was hunting. And the prey he sought was the most dangerous kind, men who were themselves hunters, who knew the rhythms of pursuit and evasion, who would not die easily. The camp was exactly where Samuel had said it would be. It sat in a small clearing at the base of a rocky hill, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a semicircle of tall pines. 2 canvas tents stood side by side, their openings facing a large fire that burned low and orange in the center of the clearing, casting flickering shadows that danced across the snow. 5 horses were tied to a rope strung between 2 trees, their breath steaming in the frigid air, their occasional snorts and shuffles the only sounds besides the crackling fire. Scattered around the fire were the remnants of an evening meal, tin plates scraped clean, empty whiskey bottles, the picked-over bones of what had been a deer. 4 men sat around the fire, talking in low voices, punctuated by occasional laughter. The 5th, the one on watch, stood at the edge of the clearing about 20 yards from the fire, his rifle resting on his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkness in a perfunctory way that suggested boredom rather than genuine vigilance. Cherokee crouched in the shadows beyond the firelight, studying them with the patient intensity of a predator. He recognized Silas Hark immediately, the tall man with the scarred cheek that Samuel had described, sitting closest to the fire with his coat open despite the cold, a bottle of whiskey in one hand. He was laughing at something one of the others had said, his voice loud and rough, carrying clearly through the still air. "And the damned Cherokee woman just stood there in the mud, staring at me like I'd done something wrong," Hark was saying, "like she had some kind of right to be upset. So I put the butt of my rifle in her face. Problem solved. No more staring, no more annoying singing, just quiet." The other men laughed. One of them, Roy Jessup, the massive man with the shotgun resting across his knees, slapped his thigh appreciatively. "You always were efficient, Silas. Never waste time on things that don't matter." "Efficient and effective," Hark agreed, taking a long drink from his bottle. "That's the secret to this job, boys. Don't think too much, don't feel too much. Just do what needs doing and collect your money. These Indians and runaways, they're not like us. They don't feel things the same way. It's like putting down a sick dog. You're actually doing them a favor, ending their misery." More laughter. Cherokee's hands tightened on his knife until his knuckles went white. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to charge forward, to bury the blade in Hark's throat and watch the light leave his eyes. But he forced himself to wait. Patience was a hunter's greatest weapon. Rage was useful, could provide strength and focus, but only when properly controlled and directed. Uncontrolled rage got you killed. So he waited, watched, learned their patterns. Over the next 2 hours, he observed everything. How the man on watch, Dutch Crane, one of the younger brothers, checked the perimeter every 15 minutes, but always in the same pattern, always missing the cluster of rocks where Cherokee hid. How the men around the fire drank steadily, passing bottles back and forth, their voices growing louder and their movements less coordinated as the alcohol did its work. How Roy Jessup's eyes kept drooping closed, despite his efforts to stay awake. How Clayton Moss, the thin one, was the most alert, his eyes constantly moving, his hand never far from the knife at his belt. By midnight, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The whiskey bottles were empty. 3 of the men had stumbled off to their tents, leaving only Hark and Moss by the fire, their conversation growing slow and slurred. Dutch Crane, still on watch, had found a fallen log to sit on and was fighting a losing battle against sleep, his head drooping forward every few minutes before jerking back up. Cherokee moved. He circled around the clearing, staying low and using every shadow, every tree, every irregularity in the terrain to remain invisible. He reached the horses first, moving among them like smoke, whispering soft Cherokee words that calmed them even as he cut the rope that held them with a single stroke of his knife. The animals stirred, but did not bolt, their trust in humans making them docile, even when freed. Cherokee tied the severed ends of the rope together loosely, creating the illusion that nothing had changed. Next, he approached the weapon cache near the fire. 4 rifles stacked together, several powder horns, a box of shot and wadding. He could not take them. The noise would alert everyone, but he could sabotage them. Working quickly and silently, he loosened the flints on 3 of the rifles, rendering them useless without obvious damage. He poured water from his skin into the touch holes of the others, soaking the powder. It would take precious seconds for anyone trying to use these weapons to realize they were compromised. Then he moved toward Dutch Crane. The young man was fully asleep now, sitting on his log with his chin resting on his chest, his rifle propped beside him, snoring softly. Tawakoni approached from behind, each step carefully placed, each movement smooth and controlled. He was 3 feet away when a twig snapped under his foot. Not loud, just a small crack, but enough. Dutch's eyes flew open. His hand reached for his rifle, but Tawakoni was already moving. He wrapped one arm around Dutch's throat from behind and clamped his other hand over the young man's mouth, cutting off any sound. Dutch struggled, his hands clawing at Tawakoni's arm, his legs kicking, panic giving him strength. But Tawakoni held firm, applying steady pressure to the carotid arteries on either side of the neck. It took 15 seconds, long, terrible seconds where Dutch thrashed and fought and gradually weakened. Finally, his body went limp. Tawakoni held the pressure a moment longer to be certain, then lowered him to the ground. He checked for a pulse. Still alive. Unconscious, but alive. Tawakoni wanted him alive, wanted him to wake up and see what had happened, wanted him to carry the message back to whatever authorities would listen. He dragged Dutch's body into the shadows and took his rifle and ammunition. Then he returned to the clearing and stepped into the firelight. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said in clear English. The men's heads snapped up with the jerky motion of people yanked from drowsiness into confusion. For a moment, they just stared at him, their alcohol-fogged brains struggling to process what they were seeing. A Cherokee man, armed, standing calmly in their camp, as if he had every right to be there. Then Silas Hark stood, his hand going to the pistol at his belt with the automatic motion of a man who had drawn weapons 1,000 times before. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, though even as he asked, recognition was dawning in his eyes. "Wait, you're that Cherokee we chased, the one helping the runaway slave." "I am," Tawakoni confirmed. "My name is Tawakoni, and you killed my wife." Hark frowned, then understanding flickered across his face. "The singing woman, on the trail." He laughed, though there was uncertainty in it now. "Hell, that was 2 years ago, and she was just one Indian among thousands. You really think—" "I think," Tawakoni interrupted, his voice flat and cold, "that you murdered an innocent woman because her voice annoyed you. I think you laughed about it, bragged about it, and I think you have continued to hunt and kill and destroy lives ever since, believing there would never be consequences." Hark drew his pistol and aimed it at Tawakoni's chest. Clayton Moss scrambled to his feet, reaching for his knife. From the tents came the sounds of movement, the other men waking, realizing something was wrong. "You got balls, I'll give you that," Hark said, his voice gaining confidence now that he had a weapon pointed at his adversary. "Walking into our camp like this, but you're also the dumbest son of a bitch I ever met. You're gonna die tonight, Redskin. Slow and painful. We're gonna make sure of that." Tawakoni did not move. He stood there, calm and still, his stolen rifle hanging at his side, his knife visible in his belt but not drawn. "You may be right," he said. "I may die tonight, but I will not die alone, and I will not die quietly." And then, from the darkness behind the patrol, a voice rang out in Cherokee. "Edoda unigvsti, Father, we stand with you." Kanuna stepped into the clearing, his rifle raised and steady. Behind him came 3 more Cherokee men, all of them armed, all moving with the confidence of warriors who had made peace with death. They had followed Tawakoni despite his wishes, despite the elders' prohibition, despite every rational reason to stay hidden, because sometimes brotherhood matters more than survival. Hark's confidence faltered visibly. He looked at the Cherokee men, counted them, assessed the situation with the cold calculation of someone who understood that mathematics sometimes matters more than courage. 4 rifles pointed at 5 men. In the first volley, at least 2 would die, maybe 3, maybe more. "This is a mistake," Hark said, his voice shaking now despite his attempts to sound authoritative. You kill us, there'll be hell to pay. Soldiers will come, hundreds of them. They'll burn every Cherokee settlement from here to the Mississippi. Perhaps, Kanuna said calmly, but you will not be alive to see it. Wait, Hark said, raising his free hand. Wait, we can talk about this. We got money, $100, $200. It's yours. Just let us go. Tawakoni walked toward him slowly, each step deliberate. When he was 5 feet away, he stopped. Do you remember her? Tawakoni asked quietly. The woman who sang, the Cherokee woman whose skull you crushed. Do you remember her face, her voice? Do you remember the moment when the light left her eyes? Hark's face had gone pale. I was just following orders. The government wanted you people moved. I was just doing my job. Her name was Adsila, Tawakoni said. She was my wife. She was sick. She was weak. She was no threat to anyone, and you killed her because her singing annoyed you. I'm sorry, Hark whispered, though whether from genuine remorse or simply from fear was impossible to tell. I swear to God I'm sorry. I didn't know she was your wife. I didn't know. I do not want your apology, Tawakoni said, and I do not believe you're sorry. I want you to understand that your life is ending, that you will never hunt another person, never laugh about another murder, and that somewhere perhaps Adsila's spirit will know that justice, however incomplete, however late, was finally served. He raised his rifle. Silas Hark screamed. The gunshot echoed through the mountains like thunder. They burned the camp when it was over. Tawakoni stood at the edge of the clearing as dawn broke over the mountains, watching the flames consume the tents, the supplies, the bodies of the men who had hunted him and his people. The fire roared and crackled, sending smoke spiraling into the pale morning sky, creating a column of grey that could probably be seen for miles. The heat was intense, almost painful even at this distance, but Tawakoni did not move. He stood there, his rifle hanging loose in his hand, his face illuminated by the orange glow, his eyes empty of everything except exhaustion. It had not been clean. It had not been easy. 3 men were dead, Silas Hark, Roy Jessup and Clayton Moss. Abel Crane had surrendered immediately when the shooting started, had thrown down his weapons and begged for mercy with tears streaming down his face. They had tied him up alongside his brother Dutch, who had regained consciousness shortly after the violence began. The 2 young men sat now at the edge of the clearing, bound and terrified, watching their camp burn and their companions' bodies turn to ash. Kanuna approached Tawakoni, his rifle slung over his shoulder, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. It is done, he said in Cherokee, his voice flat. Tawakoni nodded but did not speak. His hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the night finally draining away, leaving only the weight of what he had done. The 2 who lived, Kanuna continued, gesturing toward the bound brothers. We are letting them go. I have told them to spread the word that the Cherokee do not forget, that we do not forgive, that there are still some of us who will not accept being hunted without fighting back. Good, Tawakoni said quietly. Kanuna studied him with concern. You got what you came for, justice for Adsila, vengeance against her killer. But you do not look satisfied. You do not look at peace. Tawakoni finally turned to look at him, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Justice does not bring peace, he said. It only silences the screaming for a while, and vengeance tastes like ash in the mouth. I thought... He paused, struggling with words. I thought killing him would make me feel whole again, but it does not. She is still dead. The trail still happened. Our people are still scattered and broken. Nothing has changed except that 5 more men are dead. Then why did you do it? Kanuna asked gently. Because it needed to be done, Tawakoni said. Because men like Hark will continue hunting and killing unless someone stops them. Because he trailed off, then started again. Because Samuel was right. It is not about bringing back the dead. It is about protecting the living. About drawing a line and saying this far and no further. Kanuna nodded slowly. And what will you do now? The Cherokee camp will not welcome you back. The elders made that clear. You have defied them, brought attention upon us all. Even I, he paused, pain flickering across his weathered face. Even I may face consequences for helping you. Tawakoni looked south toward the vast expanse of forest and mountain that stretched beyond the burning camp, toward the distant lands where Samuel's wife might still live, if she lived at all. I made a promise, he said, to Samuel. I told him I would help him find his wife. Kanuna's eyes widened in disbelief. That is impossible. She was sold to Louisiana, to the cane fields. You do not even know which plantation. Louisiana is 1,000 miles away, through territory where a Cherokee will be shot on sight, and a black man traveling free will be captured immediately. You would have to cross rivers, avoid patrols, navigate cities where both of you are hunted. It cannot be done. Then I will die trying, Tawakoni said simply. You will die, Kanuna said flatly. There is no trying about it. You will die, and Samuel will die, and it will all be for nothing. Tawakoni met his eyes. Then we will die free. We will die walking towards something instead of running away. We will die as brothers, and maybe that is enough. Kanuna stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. A sad, tired smile that carried both grief and pride. You are the most stubborn man I have ever known, he said, and the bravest, but also the most foolish. He placed a hand on Tawakoni's shoulder, a gesture that carried the weight of farewell. Go then, Kanuna said. Walk your impossible path. But know this, you do not walk it alone in spirit. I will return to Samuel. I will tell him what you have done. I will care for him until you return, or until he is healed enough to follow you, and I will remember you as you are now, a man who kept his promises, even when those promises led to death. Tawakoni gripped Kanuna's arm tightly. Thank you, brother, for everything. Kanuna nodded. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest with the other Cherokee men, leaving Tawakoni alone in the clearing as the fire burned itself out. Tawakoni stood there for another hour, watching the flames die, watching the smoke fade, watching the camp that had been the base for so much suffering turn to charred wood and scattered ash. When the last ember had cooled, he turned south and began to walk. He walked alone, but he carried with him the memory of Adsila's smile, Samuel's desperate hope, Kanuna's fierce loyalty. He carried the weight of promises made and debts unpaid. He carried the knowledge that the journey ahead was probably impossible, that death waited somewhere on the long road to Louisiana, but he walked anyway. Because some things are worth dying for, because some promises cannot be broken, no matter the cost. Because he had carried one man 40 miles through the snow to save his life, and now he would walk 1,000 miles through hostile territory to help that man find his wife. 2 weeks later, Samuel stood for the first time since his injury. Aita helped him, supporting his weight with surprising strength for a woman of her age, as he eased himself upright. Pain shot through his leg immediately, sharp and vicious, as if someone had driven a hot spike through the bone. He gritted his teeth and bore it, refusing to cry out, refusing to show weakness. He took one step, then another, his movements slow and unsteady, his damaged leg dragging slightly. But he walked. Kanuna watched from the doorway of the shelter, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. You heal fast, he said. I have to, Samuel replied through gritted teeth. Tawakoni is out there alone, walking into death to keep a promise he made to me. He is the kind of man who needs no help. Ah, every man needs help, Samuel said firmly. He looked at Kanuna, his eyes fierce despite the pain that made sweat bead on his forehead. You said he went south to find information about my wife, to prepare the way. Yes, Samuel's jaw tightened with determination. Then I'm going after him, as soon as I can walk 10 miles without collapsing. You can barely walk 10 feet without pain, Kanuna observed. You will not make it 10 miles. You will certainly not make it 1,000 miles to Louisiana. I'll make it, Samuel said with absolute certainty, because I have to, because he's doing this for me, because my wife is waiting if she's still alive, and because I will not let him walk into death alone. Kanuna studied him for a long moment, seeing something in the younger man's eyes, a resolve that matched Tawakoni's own, a willingness to die for something that mattered more than survival. Finally, he sighed. You are as stubborn as he is, Kanuna said. Very well, I will go with you. Samuel blinked in surprise. You would do that? Risk everything to help us? Someone has to keep you both alive, Kanuna said dryly. And besides, he paused, looking out at the mountains where his people struggled to survive in hiding. Besides, I am tired of hiding, tired of running, tired of watching my people fade away like morning mist. If I am going to die, I would rather die doing something that matters. He walked over to a pack in the corner of the shelter and began loading it with supplies: dried meat, water skins, ammunition, blankets, medicine. We leave when you can walk 5 miles without stopping, he said. Until then, you rest and heal and grow strong. Samuel nodded, gratitude overwhelming him. Thank you. They found Tawakoni 5 weeks later in a small riverside settlement on the northern edge of Louisiana. He was sitting outside a ramshackle tavern that catered to rivermen and traders, his back against the rough wooden wall, his eyes constantly scanning the muddy street. He looked thinner than Samuel remembered, his face gaunt and lined with exhaustion, his clothes worn and stained from weeks of travel, but his eyes were still sharp, still alert, still carrying that intensity that suggested he was always thinking 3 steps ahead. When he saw Samuel and Kanuna approaching, Samuel limping badly but walking under his own power, Kanuna moving with the silent grace of a born woodsman, he stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. Then recognition dawned, and his shoulders sagged with a mixture of relief and resignation. You should not have come, he said, though there was no real anger in his voice. Neither should you, Samuel replied, limping over and sitting down beside him with a grimace. But here we are. Tawakoni almost smiled. Here we are. Samuel looked at him closely, seeing the toll the journey had taken. Did you find her? Find information about Sarah? Tawakoni nodded slowly. She is here, on a plantation called Belterre, about 10 miles upriver. I have been watching it for 12 days, learning the patterns, counting the guards, mapping the layout. And, Samuel's voice was tight with hope and fear, and it is heavily guarded, at least 20 men, maybe more. Dogs, guns, high walls around the compound. There is no way in that does not end with us all dead or captured. Samuel looked at him steadily. So what do we do? Tawakoni was silent for a long moment, staring at the muddy river that flowed past the settlement, carrying boats and dreams and sometimes bodies south toward the Gulf of Mexico. Then he spoke quietly. We do what men like us always do. We find a way, or we die trying, but we do not give up. We do not abandon her. We do not turn away. Kanuna crouched beside them, his weathered face serious. If we do this, he said, we cannot come back. The Cherokee camp will not shelter us. I've already been cast out for helping with the patrol. We will be hunted for the rest of our lives. Every white man's hand will be against us. I know, Tawakoni said. Then why? Kanuna asked. Why risk everything for a woman you have never met? Tawakoni looked at Samuel, then back at Kanuna. Because some things are worth dying for. Because brotherhood means standing together, even when standing means falling. And because I once failed to protect my own wife, I will not fail to help Samuel protect his. Samuel's throat tightened with emotion. Thank you, he whispered, for everything. Tawakoni placed a hand on his shoulder. Thank me when we succeed. Or do not thank me at all, because we will be dead." They made their move 3 weeks later, on a moonless night when thick fog rolled in from the river. The plan was insane, cobbled together from desperation and hope, and the kind of reckless courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. They would enter the plantation not by force, but by guile. Kanuna would pose as a slave trader bringing merchandise to sell, with Samuel and Tawakoni playing the roles of captured runaways. Once inside, they would find Sarah, free as many others as possible, and escape into the swamps that surrounded the plantation, where dogs could not easily track and horses could not follow. It should not have worked. By all logic and probability, it should have ended with all three of them dead or in chains. But fortune favors the foolish sometimes. The guards, bored and confident in their security, barely questioned Kanuna's story. Samuel, his hands bound but his eyes alert, spotted Sarah working in the kitchen house, thinner than he remembered, marked by hardship, but alive and beautiful, and everything he had dreamed of during the long months of separation. When their eyes met across the compound, the recognition was instant and electric. The escape that followed was chaos, fire and confusion, and the element of surprise. Tawakoni cut chains while Samuel and Sarah reunited in tears and fierce embraces. Kanuna held the guards at bay with his rifle, his aim true despite his age. 15 enslaved people fled with them into the night, into the swamps, into the fog that swallowed them all. Gunfire echoed through the darkness. Dogs barked. Men shouted. But by the time the plantation owners' forces organized pursuit, the runaways were gone, vanished into the treacherous swampland like ghosts dissolving into mist. They were never seen again, not in Louisiana, not in Tennessee, not anywhere the authorities searched. Weeks later, a hunter reported finding a strange trail in the forests north of Memphis. 3 sets of footprints leading away from civilization into the deep wilderness where white men rarely ventured, and then, mysteriously, only 2 sets continuing, as if one person had simply vanished into the earth itself. The Cherokee who heard the tale said the spirits had taken them, had rewarded their courage by making them part of the land itself. The escaped slaves who made it to freedom told a different story, of a Cherokee hunter and a black man and their families living free somewhere in the mountains, beyond the reach of laws and chains, and men who hunted humans for profit. Some say they lived out their days in peace, hidden and free. Others say they continued to help runaways, becoming legends whispered about in slave quarters and feared by those who made their living from cruelty. Still others claim they walked until they became something more than human, 2 souls bound by grief and brotherhood and promise, transformed into symbols of resistance that could never be captured or killed. But everyone agrees on one thing. The Cherokee hunter carried a wounded slave 40 miles through the snow, and that act of impossible compassion created a brotherhood that transcended race and nation and even death itself. 2 men who had lost everything found each other in the frozen mountains. 2 men who should have been enemies became brothers. 2 men who were hunted became hunters, and in the end they walked together into freedom or into legend. And the difference between those 2 things was never entirely clear. The patrol who survived carried the message back. There are still men who will not be broken. There are still people who will fight back. There are still promises that matter more than life itself. And somewhere in the vast American wilderness, 2 ghosts continued walking, always together, never alone.
I'm freezing. I'm bleeding, slowly fading away. But don't worry, I'm fine. The cold has settled in my heartbeat. like winter living in my veins. Every breath feels numb and fragile. Every smile just hides the pain. I'm breaking quietly in silence, falling slow without a sound. Yet I keep saying I'm okay, while my world burns to the ground. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. Maybe pain just learned to live here. Maybe sorrow feels like home. So I wear my wounds like armor and survive them all alone. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. If you ever see me smiling, no, it's just my last defense. 'Cause sometimes love means hiding how much you're suffering. No, I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. It's okay.
They say just forget. Move on like it's easy. But forgetting you feels like remembering someone I've never seen. I've been trying to erase you from the places in my mind, but the harder that I fight it, the more you're hard to leave behind. Every memory keeps slipping through the cracks I try to close, like a face I should remember, but somehow never know. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Every moment turns to fragments, every thought just fades to blue, like I'm searching for a feeling that still only leads to you. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Oh, 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 oh. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true.